The chapel held its breath when Tiffany lifted her chin and said, "Mother-in-law, did you really come to your husband's funeral in that cheap dress?" My son Andre studied the floor. Belle squeezed my fingers and whispered, "Mama, breathe." I kept my hands folded and let the room measure me. Tiffany smiled for the audience. "Look at her shoes," she said, "flea market at best." "Poor woman," someone murmured. The sting rose hot, then settled into a line of steel behind my ribs. I looked at the casket and remembered my husband's last words. "Claudia, when I am gone, do not let anyone step on your name." I met Tiffany's eyes. She wanted a scene. She wanted me small. I gave her silence. She mistook it for weakness and kept performing. She preached about class and taste and education. She shook her head at my dress. She invited me to borrow from her closet next time. People nodded, eager to agree with power they thought they understood. I traced the buttons with my thumb and counted 3 breaths. One for grief. One for dignity. One for what would come next. I stood, smoothed the skirt and said this. "Tiffany, some things are not cheap. Grief is not cheap. Respect is not cheap. And the truth is never cheap." Then I sat and watched and let the hush fall in this room. Inside that hush I made a promise. By sundown she would learn who she had spoken to. I left the chapel without a backward glance and carried the hush with me like a folded shawl across my shoulders, a hush that steadied my breathing and sharpened my sight, a hush that kept me from wasting my strength on an argument that would only feed a small spirit craving attention. And when I reached the curb the air felt cooler than it had inside, as if the sky itself had stepped closer to hear whatever I would decide next. So I looked up and told Elias that I was going home to make tea. And a plan, and that by sundown the mask would begin to slip from every face that had dared to call my grief cheap. And I drove the old Honda because I wanted the whole city to keep underestimating me a little longer while I put my house in order. Then I parked and climbed the stairs and opened my door and set my purse down and slid off my shoes and stood barefoot on the cool wood and listened to the clock in the refrigerator and the quiet that follows a storm of careless words, and I filled the kettle and chose my chipped white cup because it had survived so many seasons and because a scar that holds steady is a sermon in porcelain. Then while the water came alive I touched the back panel of the hall closet and let it swing inward to the narrow room, the room my children had never seen, the room Elias and I built when we learned that privacy is not secrecy but the discipline to keep sacred things safe. And I switched on the lamp and the shelves woke into view with their binders and labeled tabs and the tidy rows of manila folders and the small locked drawer where the memory cards and thumb drives rested. And I felt the familiar calm of a well-kept desk settle through me like warm honey. Then I took down the binder with my name, Claudia Johnson, written in my own careful script, and I placed it on the table and opened to the tab named Incident Notes and slid a blank sheet into place, and I wrote today's date and the word chapel and a line for the time and a line for witnesses and a line for direct quotes because order invites courage the way a cleared path invites footsteps. And when the kettle sang I poured hot water over the tea and the steam rose like the breath of a new promise and I held the cup and stood at the window and watched a child ride a bike too fast and a mother lift a hand and call slow down and I thought how often I had done the same with my children, how often a woman's warning had saved someone's knees from the hard kiss of concrete. And I knew that today my warning would save more than knees, it would save a name. It would save a household from building itself on rotten beams of pride. So I sat and sipped and opened the tab named Legal Contacts and ran my finger under the neat letters of attorney Lena Patel and remembered the afternoon she taught me to keep timelines simple and to let facts speak before feelings. And I remembered Elias laughing while he washed peaches and telling me that the hardest part of any battle is the silence before the first right move, and I whispered to him that the first move was coming now. Then I called Belle because she answers like a sunrise, quick and warm. And she said, "Mama, are you safe?" And I said, "Yes, child, safer than I look." And she asked what I needed and I said, "I need you to trust me," and she said, "I do." And I asked about Andre and she said he is quiet with that heavy quiet men use when they are not ready to see. And I told her we would not press because sight that is forced becomes denial. And after I hung up I called Andre and he picked up on the third ring and I told him I loved him and that I was disappointed by his silence and that love is still love when it tells the truth. And he swallowed and said he did not want a fight and I said I did not want one either, which is why I was building a record. And he asked me what that meant and I said it meant that decency looks the same in private and in public and I would be measuring that in the days ahead. Then I called Lena and she answered the way a woman answers when her desk is clean. And I told her what happened and then I told her what I intended and she listened without rushing and then asked for 3 simple things: a written timeline in my own words, a list of witnesses willing to jot what they saw, and any prior moments that showed a pattern of contempt disguised as advice, and she said we would keep everything within policy and law, and protect my peace while we demanded respect and accountability, and I said amen without saying the word. Then I began the work, and I pulled a new divider and printed checklist in neat black letters and made 5 lines beneath it: camera, bank, work culture, family boundary, community witness. And I started with camera because cameras watch even when hearts look away. And I opened the small safe and took out the doorbell memory card and backed it up to a thumb drive and labeled it with the date and the hour, and I scrolled the log until I saw a delivery the day before the funeral and a signature that looked like Tiffany's hand, and I printed the still image to tack into the binder later. And I opened my phone and took pictures of the printout because copies keep stories from being edited by fear. Then I moved to the second line and called the bank and asked for Darnell, who had handled our accounts for years with patience and respect, and he offered condolences and said he could meet in the morning, and that a private room would be ready, and I asked Andre to join that meeting because light must enter the whole house, not just the parlor, and I wrote 9 o'clock on a yellow note and slipped it into the binder. Then I looked at the third line and thought of the boutique where Tiffany worked and the culture she claimed to understand, how she sorted people by jackets and shoes and spoke of education while ignoring kindness, and I decided to pay a visit soon, not to make a scene but to watch how a place treats a woman who does not announce her resources, and I smiled because observation is a higher form of speech. Then I turned to the fourth line and wrote a sentence I have written before when storms rolled in: the boundary is the blessing, and beneath it I wrote what I would and would not accept in my own home. I would accept conversation in good faith. I would not accept contempt as style. I would accept questions. I would not accept mockery. I would accept effort. I would not accept excuses, and I left space to sign it later like a small covenant with myself. Then I turned to the fifth line and considered who in my community might bear witness to decency. And I wrote Ms. Lorraine, who lives 2 doors down and prays with her hands in the garden, and I wrote Pastor Green, who knows how to hold a room without breaking anyone inside it. And I felt the plan gather bones and stand up inside the binder, and I took a breath and washed my cup and cleaned the small lamp glass in the secret room and slid the panel shut and returned to the living room where the late light spread like warm butter across the floor. And I thought about the first store Elias and I opened when everyone said elegance would not live on that block, and how we had proved that grace can rent any corner if you treat people like people. And I remembered the woman who walked in wearing a coat 2 decades old and walked out with a scarf she saved for, and how Elias carried her bag to the door the way a man carries a blessing. And I told myself that I would carry myself the same way now. Then morning came and I dressed simple and pinned on my pearl studs because a small light near the face reminds the soul to glow from W. Ethan, and I walked to the bank, and Darnell met me and led me to a room that could turn its glass opaque with a touch so that privacy would not have to beg. And Andre arrived a few minutes late with his shoulders pulled up like he was trying to wear his neck as a helmet, and we sat, and Darnell reviewed the account activity with calm respect, and he showed a cash withdrawal the day before the funeral and a note field that read event styling, and he showed a mortgage application file that had been opened and a proposed income line that did not exist yet, and he did not judge. He simply let the facts sit between us like a straight-back chair, and I thanked him and asked for printed summaries, and I watched Andre read the numbers like they were a language he wanted to love but had never studied, and I told him softly that love requires fluency and truth. Then I left and walked to the boutique and stood across the street and watched the door, and I saw Chloe inside arranging a display with quiet pride, and I saw Tiffany sweep in late and bright with a phone pressed to her ear and an expression that said the room should be grateful for her presence. And I waited because patience is not surrender, patience is strategy. And when I returned home I typed a clean timeline for Lena and attached the banknotes and a still image from the camera and a short letter Chloe had already sent to say that in her training she had been told to meet every customer with equal respect and that she had seen that rule bent by others, and Lena replied that same afternoon with calm instruction, that I should let managers lead workplace coaching and that my presence would be as owner only, that at home my boundary list should be spoken once and posted once and then enforced without drama, that community can be a stage when truth needs light but that privacy must still guide the script, and that if I needed to cry I must do it without apology because tears are not weakness, they are weather, and weather changes the ground. An evening came and with it Andre with grocery store roses crinkling in their sleeve, and he held them like an apology, still looking for the right words. And I took them and set them in water and invited him to sit at the table where Elias and I had solved so many problems, and I laid out the facts without raising my voice because shouting makes truth sound like noise, and I told him what Tiffany had said in the chapel, and what the camera had seen, and what the banknotes meant and what respect requires when a woman has outlived her husband and intends to outlive humiliation, and I told him that a home where contempt naps on the couch is not a home where his mother will rest. And he looked at his hands and then looked at the window and then said he did not want to choose between his wife and his mother, and I said I was not asking him to choose, I was asking him to choose between contempt and respect. And he said he needed time and I said, take the time but do not spend it trying to make nonsense sound like wisdom. Then he left and the door clicked in that small way a door clicks when a son is still a boy somewhere inside his rib cage. And I cleaned the kitchen and made tea and Ms. Lorraine knocked and brought her own mug because she believes that sharing tea is a kind of prayer. And she listened and said a woman becomes dangerous in the best way when she remembers her first name, and I smiled and told her that my name felt polished tonight, and she told me to water the marigolds in the morning, and to wear my pearls because small light can help a heart refuse the invitation to dim. And I slept long enough to dream of Elias laughing with a bowl of peaches. And at dawn I baked banana bread because sweetness in a house keeps bitterness from building a nest. And I sliced one loaf for Mr. Ramirez and one for Chloe with a note that said thank you for treating people like people. And I dressed in navy slacks and a white shirt and a soft cardigan that had seen many good days, and I took the binder and rode the bus because I wanted to sit with my neighbors and feel the city breathe. And before noon the boutique manager called and asked me to attend a coaching session as an observer because she had reviewed footage and complaints that deserved attention, and I thanked her and agreed, and then I set the bread on the counter for later and straightened the room so that when I came home I would be greeted by the life I was choosing, and I checked my list again, camera secured, banknotes printed, work culture under review, boundary language ready to post by the front door, community witness identified. And I felt the spine of the plan hold me upright from heel to crown, and I touched Elias's picture and told him I was keeping my word, and I locked the door and stepped into the bright noon with a calm that did not ask permission, and I knew that Act 1 was done, and that the next act would not be a fight in a hallway or a whisper campaign or a performance of rage. It would be a steady unveiling, a methodical lifting of veils, and the woman who had called my grief cheap would learn that truth does not raise its voice to be heard. It simply turns on the light and waits while eyes adjust. Morning steadied me like a hand on my back as I opened the binder and touched each tab. Then I told myself that investigation is love for the truth written down. I called Mr. Ramirez to review the foyer cameras around the funeral, and he welcomed me to a quiet room with a clean screen, and we watched ordinary comings and goings until a courier brought a garment box for Tiffany the day before the service. And later Tiffany herself signed with a rushed scrawl while speaking into her phone as if the world owed her more minutes than the rest of us. I asked for still images with timestamps and he printed them for my records, and I thanked him for guarding doors and people with the same attention. Outside the sun felt undecided, and I walked to the bank so my breath could even out before I met the numbers. Darnell greeted me with that steady voice that makes heavy news feel carryable, and he guided me to the glass-walled room that turns private with a touch. And he set a stack of activity reports on the table and stepped back so the facts could take their seat. There it was, a cash withdrawal the day before the funeral with a memo that read event styling, a cluster of charges tied to a luxury rental and a boutique courier, and a mortgage file built on income that did not exist, and Darnell did not judge. He simply printed and initialed each page so my binder could keep its spine. I asked for notes on 2 failed attempts to add an authorized user and 2 attempts to change a beneficiary, and he found both rejected for missing documents, and I saw a pattern that looked like smoke testing for a fire someone intended to set. I called Belle on my way out and told her I was fine and that facts were gathering politely, and she said she would be ready for whatever daylight required. Across the street from the boutique I paused to study the windows, because a window tells on a store before a word is spoken. Chloe was arranging scarves with the patience of someone who understands that care is a form of music. Tiffany arrived late with a bright entrance, laughing into her phone, and pointed a woman in a plain coat toward the clearance rack without a greeting. I stood quietly and watched the woman turn away with her dignity folded like a small napkin in her pocket, and I stored that image beside the banknote and the courier's slip. I went home and typed a clean timeline for attorney Lena Patel, attached the stills and the ledger prints, and sent a narrative as simple as a recipe. Lena replied that we would set the stage for an accountable conversation, and that I should attend a coaching meeting as owner and observer, and she asked me to prepare a brief values statement that could anchor the room when the wind tried to push it sideways. I boiled water, poured tea, and wrote 3 lines. Elegance is measured by how we treat people, not by the price of what we sell. Every client is a person first. Respect begins before the greeting and lasts after the receipt. I slept with the binder on the nightstand because sometimes paper keeps nightmares from inventing their own evidence. In the morning I visited Ms. Lorraine to let wisdom walk beside me. She listened on her porch while finches worked the feeder and said, "Do not let them hire you as their anger. Let them meet you as their mirror." I promised her I would hold still and let the truth reflect itself without noise. At the boutique, the manager gathered the staff in the break room. I thanked the team for their work and said the room belonged to decency. Then I read the 3 lines. The air softened. The manager asked Chloe to describe best practices from training, and Chloe spoke about greeting everyone with the same respect and offering options without assumption. And a few shoulders dropped the way people settle when safety returns. Then the manager invited Tiffany to share her approach. Tiffany said she reads cues to protect the brand from people who do not belong in luxury spaces, and she smiled like a host guarding a guest list. The room went tight. I asked a question as plainly as I could. "How do you know who belongs?" She said it is obvious, and I said obvious to whom, and the quiet that followed measured the distance between sales and service. The manager played a short camera clip from last week where Tiffany scrolled her phone while a guest waited. Then another where she waved a woman toward the back rack without asking a question. Tiffany said she was under stress and that she had high standards. I said stress is real but contempt is a choice, and I let the sentence stand without more words. We agreed on a coaching plan with weekly check-ins and documentation, and the manager reminded everyone that gifts of merchandise from clients are not allowed, and that phones stay put away when guests need hands and eyes. After the meeting, Tiffany followed me into the hallway and asked for a private word, and I granted it because dignity does not fear small rooms. She said she respected me and only wanted to help me dress better. I said advice is respect when it is invited and contempt when it is performed for an audience. I told her we would not discuss the funeral here because a workplace is not a theater. She asked if I would speak to Andre for her. I said I would speak to my son about our family values and my boundaries, and that the best help she could give herself was honest work done with kindness. From there I went to Lena with the morning written in calm ink. She drew the next steps on a legal pad. Document every action with dates. Issue formal notice of standards to Tiffany. Route any inventory problems to audit without accusation. And keep community plans gentle and clear. She also asked me to print a small sign for my front door at home that said boundary in plain language, so that anyone who entered would know the terms of peace. I went home and wrote the boundary list and posted it beside the doorbell. In the afternoon, Estelle called from the main office to report that inventory control had flagged a limited run scarf as missing, and that a photo on Tiffany's public page looked like that design. There was no proof yet, only the start of a question. I told Estelle to work with the manager and to follow the process line by line. I forwarded the note to Lena, who replied, "Keep your hands clean and your records full." I walked to the church to ask Pastor Green about using the fellowship hall for a conversation on service and respect the following week. He agreed without asking for names and said the hall belongs to the neighborhood, and that grief deserves honor, and that honor requires light. I signed the request and felt the quiet courage that comes when a woman knows a room will be ready. On my way home, I stopped at Ms. Lorraine's porch and told her the plan. She said the pot has begun to simmer. Now keep the flame even so you do not have to scrub the stove for months. I promised to season everything with truth and patience. The next morning, the manager asked me to witness an inventory review. We sat at a bright table where lies would have nowhere to hide. Tiffany entered with a tight smile. Inventory control asked about the limited run scarf. She said it was a gift from a client. The manager asked for a record. She had none. She said she purchased it with a discount. Inventory control asked for the receipt. She did not have it. The policy is clear. Gifts of merchandise are not permitted, and employee purchases must be rung and recorded. The room stayed calm. The review ended with a written request for documentation within 48 hours, and a note that non-response would trigger formal action. I left without a speech because facts did the speaking. At home, I opened the tab named Community Witness and wrote the date for the Fellowship Hall event, and a list of neighbors and choir sisters to invite. I called Belle and asked for her help with chairs and coffee, and a basket for note cards so people could share their stories of service done right. She said yes with a smile I could hear over the line. I wrote a small statement of my own to read that day. A statement with no names and no schedule of shame. Only values, receipts, and encouragement. Night came and with it a plain envelope slid under my door. Inside were screenshots of Tiffany boasting online about insider access and posing in a back room with merchandise, and a private message mocking a woman who could only afford a small scarf. There was no name on the envelope. Some neighbor had decided that truth deserved speed. I logged and printed each image, labeled them with the date and time, and placed them in the binder with a note that said anonymous submission received at dusk. In the morning, Darnell called to say the affidavit was ready, and to let me know he had found those attempts to alter beneficiary information, both denied. I walked to the bank for the signatures, thanked him, and placed the affidavit in the legal tab. On my way out, I saw Andre on the sidewalk. He looked like a man who had not slept in his own mind. He asked if I would ruin his marriage. I said truth does not ruin what is honest, it simply removes the paint from rot. He asked if all of this had to be public. I said only the part that teaches. He nodded and looked away because a nod is easier than an apology when pride is still learning its manners. At noon, Estelle called with an update. 2 clients had agreed to provide short statements about treatment in the store, and Chloe had written a thorough account of 3 incidents. Estelle would notarize them in the morning. I thanked her and felt the plan gain one more rib. Late in the day, the manager informed me that Tiffany had not produced a receipt for the scarf, and that the serial on the tag in her photo matched the missing item. Lena advised a temporary suspension pending final review. The manager carried it out with measured courtesy. Tiffany posted a vague message about jealous coworkers and unfair standards. I did not answer. I baked banana bread because a house that smells like care reminds a woman who she is. In the evening, Andre came to sign a short statement acknowledging that he had reviewed the bank documents with me. He sat at the table and kept his hands in his lap like a child waiting for permission to speak. I told him that permission lives in his own mouth now, that manhood requires sentences with subjects and verbs. He held the pen, signed, and then asked to sit in quiet. We sat. After a time he whispered, "I am sorry." I said, "I know." He asked if there was a way back. I said the way back is built of small honest days stacked in a straight line. The last phase of investigation played out like a measured song. Inventory control finalized their report. The manager completed suspension paperwork. Lena wrote a clean summary of every step we had taken and every policy we had followed. Darnell delivered his affidavit. Chloe and the 2 clients signed their statements. Ms. Lorraine sent word that she would attend the fellowship hall meeting and bring pie like proof that comfort and truth can share a plate. With the facts in place, I drafted the outline for my talk at the hall. I would speak about grief that deserves honor, service that refuses contempt, and community that stands between vanity and the vulnerable. No names, no sneers, only light. The night before the event, I walked the room with Pastor Green. We tested the microphone and the slide remote in the coffee urns. He prayed a short prayer without ceremony and asked God to keep our mouths clean and our hearts brave. I slept well because order was holding the door. Morning brought a small twist I did not expect. A message arrived from a former coworker of Tiffany, who now lived in another city. She wrote that Tiffany had a pattern at a previous store, that she mocked older clients and boasted about access she did not have, and that she left after a formal warning. She offered to send the written warning she had saved to remind herself why standards matter. I forwarded the note to Lena. Lena replied that the prior pattern might be admissible for culture training but should not be used for discipline now. I agreed and filed it under lessons rather than charges. I was not building a pile to crush a woman. I was building a path to teach a community. At noon I put on my navy and white again, slipped the pearl studs into place, and carried the binder to the church. The fellowship hall glowed with folding chairs and soft light, and the sound of neighbors who know one another by first names and baked dishes. Belle stood near the coffee, ready with note cards. Andre came and chose a seat in the row that gives a man room to stand without feeling watched. Chloe arrived early and sat near the aisle. I opened the binder, felt the steady weight, and breathed the way Elias taught me. The investigation had given me facts, and the facts had given me permission to be simple. Simple is strong. I was ready to let the truth speak in a voice that did not shout. Act 2 had reached its mark. The stage was set for the light to do what it always does when given a clear line to travel. I looked at the first slide one more time and felt the quiet thunder of justice roll through my chest, Because the courier image, the bank memo, the policy lines, and the statements from women who wanted courtesy had joined hands. And in that joining I heard my husband's voice, saying, "Claudia, hold your line." And I knew I would, for myself, for my children, and for every elder who has been measured by a price tag instead of a heartbeat. By noon the boutique felt like a stage lit by a single honest bulb, and I walked in with my binder tucked to my side and my heartbeat steady, because today was not for drama, it was for process. And when the manager nodded to me from the staircase, I understood that the hour for a formal review had arrived, so I climbed to the small office that looked over the sales floor and took the chair by the window where a woman can see people and papers at the same time, and the manager set a folder between us and said, "The inventory report is complete," and a second voice from audit read the findings in a tone that neither accused nor excused, and the words landed like measured taps on a drumhead. "The scarf in the photo is a limited run piece, the serial in the image matches, the tag logged as missing, no receipt exists, and the policy is clear." And I felt no thrill, only the calm that follows a patient harvest, because a seed of truth will always sprout, given light and time. And before I could answer, Tiffany entered with a small smile that asked to be rescued, and the manager offered her a seat and explained that this was a formal coaching review and possible disciplinary action, and that courtesy would govern our voices. And Tiffany began to explain with a thin stream of words about gifts and clients and respect and high standards and stress, and I lifted my hand once and asked a question so small it was almost tender. "Who gave you the scarf?" And she reached for a name that would not come and then said, "A loyal client." And I asked for a note or a card, and there was none, and I asked for a receipt, and there was none, and I asked what training taught her to accept gifts of merchandise, and she could not answer because the training never said that. And the room tightened the way a belt tightens when a man realizes he cannot outrun an honest pace, and the manager read the policy line aloud, and audit placed a copy on the table, and Tiffany looked at me as if blood could make a ledger forget, but I kept my face still and my voice level, and I said, "This is not a family conversation, this is a workplace process, and we will honor it." And the manager asked if Tiffany had anything else to add, and she said she had been targeted by jealous coworkers, and that people had always misunderstood her confidence. And I let the silence do its work, because silence is a teacher when ego runs out of chalk. And audit finished their findings and recommended suspension pending termination, and the manager wrote the decision in clean letters and asked Tiffany to surrender her badge, and Tiffany stood and said, "This is revenge." And I said, "No, this is policy." And she said, "You will break your son." And I said, "My son must learn the shape of truth." And she left with her shoulders squared in pride and bent in fear, and the door closed, and I did not cheer, because justice is not a party, it is a table you set for peace. I stayed in the office and watched the floor below, and saw Chloe approach an older woman in a simple coat with the same bright attention she would offer a banker in new leather. And I felt a small warmth settle under my ribs like a coal that keeps a house alive through winter. And the manager turned back to me and asked if I wished to address the staff, and I said no, the process itself had spoken. And then I asked for a few minutes alone, because grief and relief sometimes arrive arm in arm, and they need a private bench. And she understood and left, and the quiet filled the room, and I looked out over the racks and thought about the afternoon sun on the first shop Elias and I opened, and how he taught me to iron the tissue paper smooth, because careless edges make people feel unworthy before a single word is exchanged. And I pressed my fingers to the window and whispered, "I am tired and I miss you and I am not done." And I gathered the binder and went down the stairs and out to the street where the air felt like clean water. And then my phone rang, and it was Andre with his voice tight as a knot. "Please meet me at my apartment now." And I said I would, and I drove the old Honda across town with that steady engine that reminds me that quiet power is often the kind worth keeping. And when I reached his building, he opened the door with eyes that had not slept, and he said, "Tiffany has been suspended and people are talking, and what are you doing?" And I set the binder on his table and said, "I am doing the same thing I have always done. I am guarding the name you gave me at birth and the name your father built with clean hands." And he said, "You could have come to us first." And I said, "I did come to you first in a sanctuary where you looked at the floor and called my grief a misunderstanding." And he flinched, because the truth can bruise without cruelty. And I opened the binder and showed him the stills and the bank memo and the policy lines, and I told him about the clients who had signed statements and the coaching session where contempt had tried to dress as confidence. And I told him I did not ask for humiliation as a teaching tool, but once it arrived I chose to learn and to teach. And he pressed his palms to his eyes and said, "I married a woman who speaks one way in the mirror and another way to the world." And I said, "That may be so, but today is not about her character, it is about our boundary." And I slid a page to him with the boundary written in short sentences: "A home without contempt, a table without mockery, a mother without public shaming." And he read slowly, and then he asked if there was any path for mercy, and I said, "Mercy is not a pardon for the truth. Mercy is the room to change without being chased, and for that room to exist a person must first admit what they did and accept the cost." And he nodded, and his shoulders lowered as if he had set down a bag he had been carrying for years without knowing it, and then he said, "I am ashamed, and I said shame can be a door if you walk through, and he said how do I start, and I said start by calling things by their names and by writing to your wife the words I heard today without blaming your mother for how they sound, and he said he would try, and I said do not try, write and read and sign and send, and after I left I sat in the car and let myself cry because strong does not mean stone, it means living, and then I wiped my face and went home and cooked rice and greens and a small piece of fish and ate quietly because a body needs fuel to carry justice, and after dinner I walked to the church to feel the shape of the fellowship hall before the event, and Pastor Green was there with a mop in his hands because a true shepherd knows how to lift a bucket, and he asked how my spirit was holding, and I said it was split down the middle, one half made of steel, the other half made of water, and he smiled and said that is how rivers carve canyons, and I laughed just enough to remember that joy is not treason against sorrow, and we checked the mic and the screen and the urns, and he told me to go home and rest, and I did. The day of the final decision at the boutique arrived like a long-held breath, and I dressed in navy again and wore my pearl studs and carried the binder and walked in with the posture of a woman who knows the difference between vengeance and order, and the manager met me at the door and said the documentation is complete and we will proceed with termination for cause and ask for return of any company property, and she asked if I wanted to be present, and I said I would observe only because dignity is not a hammer, it is a level, and we went upstairs and Tiffany entered with eyes that had done battle with a mirror and lost, and the manager read the decision and offered space for a statement, and Tiffany said this is a conspiracy, and I said the process is written and the facts are signed, and she said you hate me, and I said I do not hate you, I hate contempt and the harm it does to the old and tea. He honest, and she began to cry, and then she stopped and said you will not win because Andre loves me, and I said his love will not hire contempt to run my family, and the manager collected the badge and the keys and gave her a list of property to return and a number to call, and it was done, and we left the room and stood near the railing and watched the floor while the staff worked, and the air felt cleaner, not because a person had been removed but because a standard had been restored, and I thanked the manager for her steady hands, and she thanked me for letting policy do its work. And we parted with a handshake that meant more than words. The collapse came that night, as collapse always does after a woman carries order all day and then meets her own empty kitchen and her own small chair and the photo of the man she loved, and she sits and the quiet grows until it fills every corner, and I let it, and I wrote my journal line for the day. I kept my promise to myself and to him, and then the tears came again, not hot like the chapel but slow like rain, and I remembered the first months of marriage and how we learned to share one small paycheck and how respect was the only luxury we insisted on buying, and I closed my eyes and said his name and thanked him for teaching me to count my breaths in threes when trouble calls, and I slept asleep without dreams. Morning returned with an honest sky, and I read a message from Andre that said he had written the letter and he wanted me to read it, and I made tea and read it, and it was not a perfect letter but it was a true letter, and he wrote that he had been blind to contempt and that he had used silence to protect his comfort instead of his mother, and that he would not do that again, and he asked for help learning how to speak with courage, and I replied that courage is a muscle built by small repetitions, and that he would practice at my table one evening a week until the fellowship hall event where he would stand if needed and claim his own voice, and he agreed, and I felt a small click inside me, the kind that means a hinge has settled and a door will swing without noise. The day before the event, Lena called with the final summary and read it aloud like a benediction. The camera stills, the bank memo, the policy line, the inventory report, the signed statements, the suspension and termination steps, and the neighbor envelope logged without speculation. And then she said a simple sentence that made my spine feel taller: you have honored process and the process has honored you. And I said thank you, because gratitude is a hallway that leads to good rooms. And that night I baked 2 loaves of banana bread and wrapped them in clean towels, because hospitality is not weakness, it is a declaration that a woman owns her space and will fill it with good. On the morning of the event my house smelled like cinnamon, and I dressed and pinned on my pearls and carried the binder and walked to the church in clear light, and Andre met me at the door and took the bread, and Belle was already there with note cards and a pen, and Pastor Green nodded, and his eyes said you are ready, and I felt ready because Act 3 had done what it came to do. It had broken the illusion that contempt could live without cost. It had validated the patience of my binder. It had taught my son the first steps of a language he will need for the rest of his life, and it had given me back my sleep, not because the world was perfect but because my own house was in order. And I stood at the edge of the fellowship hall and breathed and waited for the room to gather, and I heard Elias laughing somewhere behind my left shoulder, telling me the hardest part is always the silence before the right move, and I smiled and answered, I have moved, and now I will speak. The fellowship hall breathed like a living room for the city when the first chairs filled and the urns whispered their soft steam. And I stood by the table with my binder and my pearls and the steady weight of a woman who has chosen order over noise, and Belle moved through the rows with note cards and eyes, and Pastor Green adjusted the microphone and welcomed everyone with a prayer as brief as a match, asking for clean mouths and brave hearts, Then he stepped aside and left the room to me. I thanked the church for its shelter and said that grief is a guest who deserves a seat at the head of the table, and that today we would talk about service that guards dignity. I lifted the binder and told the room that I would use no names and make no accusations of crimes, that what I would share were patterns and policies and receipts of behavior, and that my goal was not to crush a single person but to build a rule that keeps elders safe in every public place. I clicked to the first slide. A simple line that read, "Respect begins before the greeting and lasts after the receipt." I spoke about the chapel and the hush and the way words can wound when they are shaped to win a crowd. Then I spoke about work and how a store becomes a school for the soul when every customer is treated as a person first. I showed a timeline with dates and summarized the bank memo about event styling without naming a house or a lender, and I explained how a memo can be a window if you are willing to look through it. I read one paragraph from policy, the line that says gifts of merchandise are not permitted and all employee purchases must be recorded, and I said policy is not punishment, it is a railing on a staircase so no one falls. I shared 2 short statements from older clients who had felt gently pushed away toward a clearance rack, and I thanked them for their courage. I invited Chloe to speak for a minute about training, and she stepped up with a voice steady as a metronome and said the first lesson had been to greet without judgment and to ask questions before assumptions. Then she sat and I saw 2 women in the 3rd row nod with their hands on their purses the way elders do when they feel seen. I clicked to a slide with the word culture and told a story from years ago at a different shop where Elias and I had corrected a clerk who practiced the art of reading wallets, and I said the correction had not broken her, it had built her, because she later became a manager who hired for empathy before ego. I paused and looked over the chairs and asked the room what they needed from stores and banks and offices, and voices rose: patience, clear language, chairs close to the door, a place to rest heavy bags, prices that are honest, eyes that do not dart over your shoulder to find someone shinier. I let the words hang like clean sheets on a line. Then I said I would share one more thing. The part one had not planned to speak until I felt the peace of the room holding me up, and I told them that an incident at a funeral had sent me back to my binder, and that the days since had been spent gathering facts and letting policy do what it does when given a chance. I said a suspension had occurred and a termination for cause had followed after a process with documentation, and that even now I would not say a name, because I did not want anyone to be chased down the street by gossip that thinks it is justice. I said the lesson was simple: contempt has a cost and respect is cheaper than anyone thinks. Someone in the back clapped once, and then the room clapped, not loud, but with a certain rhythm, like a train pulling a long weight into daylight. I invited people to write notes on the cards about any place in the city where elders feel small so we could work on it together. Belle passed a basket, and a woman placed a folded card with trembling fingers and whispered thank you. Andre stood at the side wall with his head bowed, and when the clapping ended he lifted his chin and the room saw his face and fell quiet again. He asked the pastor for the microphone and Pastor Green handed it to him with both hands. My son said he had something to confess, and he said he had protected his comfort with silence while his mother carried humiliation, and that he was ashamed. He said he had seen documents he could not unsee and heard statements he could not ignore, and that he had written a letter to his wife in which he called things by their names, and he said he would not ask the room to forgive what had not been confessed to them. He would only ask the room to help him learn a new language, the language of respect that does not wait for an audience to tell the truth. He handed the microphone back to the pastor and walked to the chair beside me and sat like a man who had returned to his own bones. I took the microphone again and said that this was what a new path looks like, not perfect but honest, and that a city can change when its sons decide to speak with clean mouths. After the talk we served coffee and slices of pie baked by Ms. Lorraine and banana bread from my kitchen, and neighbors lingered to share stories. I wrote notes in the binder to carry these stories to the right doors. In the middle of the fellowship, Tiffany walked in and asked to speak. Pastor Green looked at me. I said yes, and the room rearranged itself into a listening posture. Tiffany stepped halfway down the aisle and stopped where the light met the shadow on the floor. She said the suspension and termination were unfair, and that she had been targeted by jealous coworkers. And she said she had loved the brand and only wanted clients to feel the standard. I waited for her to finish. Then I said that I would not argue point by point and that this room was not a court, and that the process had been followed with notices and time to respond, and that if she had documents she could bring them to the manager and the audit team. I reminded the room that we were speaking in general terms, and that a single afternoon could not carry a lifetime of lessons. She asked for fairness. I said the records were complete and the path for appeals was clear. She turned and left as quickly as she had come, and the doors closed with the soft sound of a page being turned. I thanked everyone for their patience and said we would return to the work at hand, which was to become a Kinder City one counter and one waiting room at a time. After the formal time ended, the room became a small city of hugs and handshakes, and I stood by the table while note cards filled the basket. Chloe came to me with a face that looked taller than the week before. She said she had chosen this work because her grandmother raised her to love fabric and people in equal measure, and she thanked me for holding the line. I told her she was the line and that young hands that choose respect keep a city young. Ms. Lorraine hugged me and whispered that the pot had come to a boil and not a single drop had jumped the stove, and we both laughed. When the hall emptied, Pastor Green and I stacked chairs and he said a true meeting leaves the room cleaner than it found it, and I told him my chest felt cleaner too. Andre loaded the urns and Belle carried the basket of cards to the car, and I locked the binder in the trunk. On the way home the sun sat low and wide, and the city looked rinsed. At the apartment I set the cards on the table and began reading. One note said my granddaughter stopped going to the corner store because the clerk called her honey in a tone that turned the word into a chain. Please help. Another said my husband died last year and I stood in a bank line for an hour, and when I reached the counter the clerk told me my question was simple, and I should have figured it out. I went home and cried. Andre came by with groceries and a quiet face. He said he had met with a counselor that morning and had told the truth about his habits, that he avoids conflict until contempt builds a tower, and he said the counselor gave him 2 sentences to practice in front of a mirror: I hear you and I respect you, and also this one: I cannot agree to contempt. I told him to practice them with me now, and he did, and his voice changed halfway through, deeper and warmer, and my kitchen seemed to stand taller. I asked if he had heard from Tiffany. He said she had sent a short message that said she would take advice and representation, and that she still believed herself wronged. I told him that belief may last until a person meets the mirror without music. He nodded and looked at the marigolds on the windowsill and said the flowers were stubborn, and I said yes, that is their ministry. That night I wrote my journal line. The city listened and did not break, and I slept. Morning brought practical work. I called the boutique manager and thanked her for her patience and asked for a training day where I could read 3 pages on service and bring 2 elders to speak. She agreed with relief in her voice. I called the bank and asked Darnell if he would allow me to share our experience in a small staff huddle. Anonymized. Focused on warmth and clarity for grieving clients. He said yes and offered to set cookies on a napkin because small kindness makes policy feel like a hand, not a fence. I wrote to the library branch and asked to donate a pair of chairs near the front desk, and a sign in large print that said "Patience lives here." The director wrote back before noon, "Yes please." By the end of the day the week ahead had gained a spine made of small rooms and good promises. Late in the afternoon a message arrived from an address I did not recognize. It was from a woman who said she had worked with Tiffany in another city, and that she too had felt measured and then dismissed because she wore old shoes. And she said she did not want revenge, she wanted a place to shop where her age felt like a crown, not a curtain. I answered that she was welcome in my store any day, and that coffee would be ready, and I meant it. At supper I set 1 plate and ate my greens and fish and a small roll and thought about Elias and the first dollar we framed on the wall of the first shop, and how he said we sell clothes but by trust. I whispered that I was still buying it. Evening fell and with it a quiet visitor. The thought that the story had reached a turning point that would not need shouting to hold. I stood at the window and watched the street lamps and thanked God for plain light. The next day the training began. I stood in the boutique before opening and spoke to the team. I read the 3 lines from the hall and added one more. We never mistake a quiet elder for a small customer. Chloe shared a story about her grandmother and a church hat that took 6 months to save for. 2 new clerks wrote these lines on the inside covers of their notebooks. We staged a role play where I entered in a plain coat and asked to see a dress I could not afford, and the team practiced how to offer options without shrinking the guest. We laughed a little because laughter keeps pride from building a tent. By lunch customers were walking in and the floor moved like a river around stones. I stood to the side and watched eyes meet eyes and hands fold tissue paper without hurry. I saw a woman in a simple sweater choose a scarf and Chloe wrap it as if she were wrapping a story. The woman left smiling at the sidewalk like a person who had remembered her name. In the afternoon I walked to the bank and joined Darnell in the huddle. I told the team that sorrow makes minds foggy, and that a person in grief needs fewer steps and kinder sentences. We practiced saying we can do that for you instead of you need to, and the room changed temperature. When I thanked them, Darnell slipped a cookie into my hand like a secret vote for kindness. On my way home, I stopped by the library to see the chairs, and 2 elders were already resting with a brown bag between them and a paperback on the table. They waved without standing, and I waved back and left them in peace. That evening, Pastor Green called to say he had received 3 notes thanking the church for hosting and 1 promise of a donation for the coffee line. He said the city had not solved itself, but it had taken a step, and steps make roads. I told him that my spirit felt the same. Before bed, I opened the binder and placed the fellowship hall outline and the stack of note cards into the tab named Community. Then I closed the cover and laid my palm on it. I remembered the chapel and the hush and the words that tried to label my grief as cheap, and I felt no fire, only a clear, cool air in my chest. The public work was done without cruelty. The lesson had landed without broken glass. Tomorrow would bring more rooms to tend, but tonight the city had learned something gentle and strong, that elders do not need rescue nearly as much as they need witnesses and fair process, and that when truth stands in a circle of care, shame has no place to sit. Morning came soft as a hymn, and I woke with the taste of quiet in my mouth, a quiet earned not by winning an argument but by keeping my promise to move with order and light, and I lay for a moment and watched the square of sun climb the wall until it touched the photo of Elias. Then I said his name the way a woman says water and stood. Steam rose from the kettle and I poured it over black tea and honey, and I stood at the window until the first bus exhaled at the corner and a child in a red jacket waved at the driver like the world still wanted him, and I told myself to wave back at the day with the same trust. I opened the binder and ran my fingers over the tabs like ribs and felt that the bones of the week were sound, that the process had held, that the city had listened without breaking, and I closed it and set it aside because the next work was a quieter kind, the kind that rebuilds a life after a storm has admitted itself. I wrote a list on a yellow card the way Elias taught me: when the mind feels crowded, 3 lines only: nourish the body, keep the house, tend the circle. I began with the body. I cracked 2 eggs into the pan and sprinkled salt and watched the edges lace. Then I buttered toast and sat and ate without scrolling a screen or turning on a voice, because a woman who has fought for her name needs to taste her own breakfast and know it is hers. After I washed the plate, I set out my walking shoes and took the long block around the school, and the air held that cool promise late mornings can carry, and I lifted my chin and counted my steps in 3s, breath in and breath out, and thank you. At the small park, a bench waited under the sycamores and I sat to rest, and an older man in a cap nodded the way strangers tip a hat in a town that remembers itself, and I nodded back, and we watched the leaves work their quiet science. At home, I opened windows and stripped the bed and shook the sheets until the dust of the week let go. Then I remade the bed as if I were preparing a room for a guest I loved, because I intend to live here as my own welcomed guest. I set a fresh towel by the sink and polished the bathroom mirror until it did not lie. Then I put on soft music and swept the floors with slow strokes that made the rooms breathe. When the house was steady, I opened a new folder and wrote foundation on the tab, and I sat at the table and drew the outline for a small fund with a clear name: Quiet Strength, Elias and Claudia, and I wrote the purpose in 1 sentence: to honor elders with practical help where public rooms sometimes forget them. I listed simple grants, ride vouchers to banks and clinics, notebooks for keeping papers, small stipends for funeral clothes that fit and carry dignity, training afternoons for clerks on clear language and patient posture, small chairs for lobbies, and a phone tree of neighbors who will go with someone to a heart appointment so that words do not get lost. I called attorney Lena Patel and told her I wanted the foundation papers in plain language and the bookkeeping as clean as cold water, and she said she would draw the documents and introduce me to a bookkeeper who believes integrity is a craft. I called Belle to ask if she would sit on a tiny advisory circle of 3, and she said yes before I finished the sentence, and I called Ms. Lorraine and asked if she would lend her porch wisdom to our first meeting, and she said she would come with pie because sugar helps hard truths go down without choking. I wrote Andre a message and asked if he would consider volunteering at the welcome desk for a few weeks, greeting elders with that new voice he is learning, and he wrote back yes with a period that felt like a full breath. In the afternoon, I walked to the boutique with a bag of cookies for the staff, not as an owner delivering sugar but as a neighbor who wanted to mark a new day, and Chloe hugged me lightly and told me she had helped a woman in a thrifted coat find a dress that made her stand taller, and I told her that this was the business we were always in, not fabric but stature. On the way home, I stopped at the church and left a thank you note for Pastor Green, and a small donation for the coffee line because rooms that hold truth deserve warmth. Back at my table, I opened the basket of note cards from the fellowship hall and sorted them into 3 piles: stories, requests, offers. I phoned 3 women who had written their numbers, one who needed a ride to close an account after her husband passed, one who wanted help reading a confusing letter from a benefits office, one who wanted to write a letter praising a clerk who had treated her with open hands, and I scheduled times and wrote reminders on a clean page. Evening pulled its blanket over the street and Andre knocked gently and came in with a sack of groceries and said he had cooked stew for me in his own kitchen and wanted to share. And we set the pot on the stove and let it warm, and the smell of onions and thyme and patience rose, and we ate from bowls and did not hurry. He told me he had started the counseling sessions and that he had stood in front of the mirror and practiced, "I hear you, I respect you, I cannot agree to contempt," and he said the words felt awkward at first and then began to fit like a shirt broken in by work. He asked if I thought he could change, and I said change is a road with many small stones, and if he was willing to feel them under his feet and keep walking then the road would be his. And he nodded and said he had written another letter, this one to himself, and he placed it on the table and asked me not to read it but only to hold it for a week as a witness that it existed. I placed the envelope under the flower bowl and promised I would not open it, and a piece sat down at the table with us like a friend who knows when to speak and when to let spoons do the talking. After he left, I washed the bowls and stood at the window and watched the building across the street light up apartment by apartment, and I thought of all the lives I do not know and the quiet battles being fought with paperwork and pride and dinner for one, and I felt that my small work might add one pin of light to that board. Sleep came willingly and morning woke me with a plan for the foundation launch. Nothing loud, just an afternoon open house with 3 tables and 1 sign and book and a corner for people to tell a story on a voice recorder if they wished. I called Lena and set a date and called the community center to reserve a room and asked Belle to print signs that an elder could read from across a lobby. I wrote a short invitation for the neighborhood board and dropped copies at the barber, the laundromat, the library, the clinic, the small grocery where the owner knows whose check arrives when. 2 days before the launch my phone rang with a number that made my chest tighten and then loosen. It was Tiffany. Her voice was careful, not flat with pride, not swollen with performance, and she asked if she could meet to apologize in person. I said I could meet in the church office for 15 minutes with the pastor present. She agreed without flinching and arrived on time in a plain cardigan with no perfume that would try to outtalk the air. She sat and did not cross her arms and said she was wrong at the funeral and wrong at work and wrong at home, and that she had built her confidence on judging others and her safety on being loud, and she said she was ready to accept the loss without asking me to make it smaller for her. She did not ask for the job back and did not ask me to speak to Andre for her, and she did not tell me the city had mistreated her or the store had been unfair, and I felt for the first time that she had met a mirror that did not blink. I told her I accepted the apology and that my boundaries stood, and she nodded and said she understood, and she asked if I would allow 1 sentence of thanks and I said yes, and she said thank you for not letting me stay the person I was when we met, and then she left without trying to turn the meeting into a stage. I sat with Pastor Green and breathed and he said repentance is rare and precious, guard it without petting it, and I said I would. The launch day arrived with honest light and I set out cookies in small cups and Belle arranged chairs in circles because circles make talk easier, and Andre stood by the door with his new voice and his old kindness and said welcome and thank you and please come in. Neighbors arrived with stories and requests and offers, and the room hummed like a kitchen on a holiday, steady and warm. Chloe came off shift and sat with a woman who wanted to learn how to ask for help without apology, and they wrote sentences on a card until the woman smiled and said she could carry them in her purse. Darnell stopped by with pamphlets on simple banking steps for widows and he spoke in plain language and never once asked a question that sounded like a scold. Ms. Lorraine blessed the room with pie and laughter and a story about a bus driver who waited while an elder tied a shoe, and the room clapped quietly and some eyes shone. I stood and told the origin of quiet strength in simple lines and I named the mentors who had steadied me, a husband who believed in order and a neighborhood that believes in each other, and I said we would keep our books open for audit and our hearts open for correction. In a corner we placed a small recorder and invited elders to tell one memory of a time they were treated with respect that made them feel taller. And many did. And those recordings sounded like the river that runs through a city and keeps it alive. When the room emptied I locked the donations in a cash box and counted the note cards and thanked every chair by stacking it clean. At home I changed the towel and watered the marigolds and wrote my journal line for the day. The city spoke softly and it was louder than any shout. The next weeks unfolded like fabric laid flat. with days set aside for the foundation errands and days for rest and days for tending my own life so that the work would not eat the woman who did it. I learned again to sit on the stoop and wave, to bring in the mail for the neighbor who walks with a cane, to keep a spare umbrella by the door for whoever needs it, and to buy extra stamps because letters matter. I opened the binder less often and opened the recipe box more. And the house smelled of cornbread and greens and peace. Andre kept his weekly practice at my table, and I watched him grow a spine that did not need an audience to stand, and I watched his face relax into a man who had made a promise and kept it through 100 small choices with no witnesses. Belle visited with her students' art projects and we taped 2 on my refrigerator, and she told me she had applied to help the foundation write simple guides for other neighborhoods to hold their own afternoons of training, and I told her that seeds have found soil. One evening as the sun sat low, I carried a bouquet of marigolds to the cemetery and laid them at the stone and told Elias that the house was steady and the children were learning the old lessons in new ways. And I thanked him for the years when we made mistakes in private and learned in private so that today I could help others learn in public without shame. I sat on the grass and let memory walk beside me, not to drag me backward but to show me how far my legs had carried me. I said that grief was no longer a hole but a well deep and clear, and that I could lower a bucket and bring up strength whenever I needed it. On the way home I stopped at the boutique and watched through the glass as Chloe helped a man choose a scarf for his mother, and I remembered the first dollar Elias and I had taped to a wall and I touched the pearl studs at my ears and felt him laugh. That night the phone rang and it was a woman from across town who had heard about the chairs at the library, and she said she had sat in one to rest and it made her feel like the city had remembered her. And I told her the city had and always will whenever a person with keys remembers to open doors. Before bed I looked around my rooms, the tidy table, the binder closed and resting, the flower bowl with its small postcard of light across the water, and I felt that what began in humiliation had ripened into a harvest that fed more mouths than my own, and I knew that this was what justice is meant to do, feed and steady and teach. I slept the untroubled sleep of someone who has returned to her first name. In the morning I woke and made tea and wrote a letter to myself for the year ahead, short and clear. Guard your peace. Tell the truth kindly. Keep your house open to light. Walk. Pray. Laugh. Help. Then I wrote a letter to the city, which is to say I wrote a list of calls I would make that day, and then I made them. At noon I met Andre for lunch in the park and he told me he had closed a joint account without anger or blame and opened a path for a clean separate life. And he said he had cried and had not hidden it. And I told him that tears are not weakness, they are weather, and weather shapes stone into new beauty. We sat and watched a child fly a kite that kept dipping low and then lived again, and I thought that this was the picture I would carry into the next season. A bright insistence on rising. When I returned home I found an envelope under the door, the letter Andre had given me at supper, the week done. I placed it on the table and called him and asked if I could open it, and he said yes, and I read a page full of plain words about habit and fear and choice and hope, and at the end he had written, "Thank you for teaching me that silence can be a wall or a window, and I am learning to build windows." I set the letter beneath the flower bowl and let the marigolds judge me with their sunny eyes, and they approved. I stood in the center of my living room and turned slowly to see what I had made. A life that did not wait for apologies to become sweet. A life that did not hire bitterness as a cook. A life with chairs for strangers and rules for love. I smiled and said a small prayer without words and opened the front door to let more light in, and the room answered. And that is how the betrayals emptied themselves of power, not by flames but by a steady refusal to be small, and that is how the investigation gave way to repair. And that is how the public exposure became a public education, and that is how a woman of 66 found that her name could carry her through the hard season and set her down gently on new ground. And if you ask me what I learned, I will tell you this. The truth will out itself. Those who betray will pay their price. A woman cut by contempt can stand again, can stand better, can stand long. And the city will stand with her if you show it how. I will keep the kettle ready, the binder closed unless needed, the porch swept, the phone answered, the chairs set in a circle, the cookies wrapped in clean towels, the door unlocked for those who come in good faith, the rules posted where eyes can rest, the hope steady, the laughter near, the prayers simple, the marigolds watered, the letters mailed, the young taught, the old honored, the hurt heard, the proud softened, the quiet defended, the truth spoken gently, the boundary kept, the peace guarded, the work shared, the night welcomed, the morning received. I choose quiet strength and begin again with light in my open doorway.